Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The hum was the first thing and the last thing. It was the sound of recycled air, of strained power conduits, of the immense gravitic plates that kept the Ethelberg penal asteroid from spinning apart into the void. For Kalen, it was the sound of his life, a monotonous, unending thrum that vibrated through the soles of his regulation boots and settled deep in his bones. He had served his 8 years in the Hegemony Marine Corps, seen things that burned themselves onto the back of his eyelids, and had traded that particular hell for this one. Quieter, colder, but a prison all the same. Here, he was a warden, a guard, a cog. He was nothing. His patrol route was a masterpiece of institutional tedium. He walked along graded metal catwalks suspended over chasms of machinery that kept the facility breathing. The light was a constant, sterile white, cast from glowing strips embedded in the low ceilings, and it bleached all color from the world. Everything was gray, the walls, the uniforms, the faces of the other guards. Even the food, a nutrient paste dispensed from wall units, was a listless, unappealing shade of beige. Kalen performed his duties with the detached efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped asking why. He checked pressure seals, scanned his ident chip at checkpoints, and watched the inmates shuffle by, their eyes as vacant as his own. This rotation, however, was different. He had been reassigned. Sublevel 9, the deepest and most secure sector of Ethelberg. The pit. Down here, the ambient hum was deeper, punctuated by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a primary stasis generator. There was only one prisoner on Sublevel 9. They did not even give it a number, just a designation, Subject 0. The official docket was sparse, classified above his clearance level. All he knew was that it was alien, dangerous beyond measure, and the sole reason this entire facility had been constructed in this desolate corner of the galaxy. He stood his first watch before the containment chamber, a vast cylinder of polished obsidian-like material that rose from the floor to the ceiling in the center of a circular room. Thick, armored conduits snaked across the floor, pulsing with a faint blue light as they fed unimaginable amounts of power into the cylinder. The air was cold here, a deep, biting chill that had nothing to do with the life support and everything to do with the thing locked inside. Kalen stood his post, rifle held at a low ready, his face an impassive mask. He had seen xenohorrors that could peel a man's skin off with a thought. He was not afraid. He was simply tired. For weeks, the routine was the same. 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Stand, watch, wait. The obsidian cylinder was opaque, a perfect, seamless black that reflected his own distorted image back at him. He never saw the prisoner, but he felt it. A faint pressure against his mind, like the deep ocean stillness before a leviathan passes. The other guards spoke of it in hushed, fearful tones in the mess hall. They said it was a weapon, a living engine of destruction the hegemony had captured in the outer veil. They said it could flatten cities, boil oceans. They said it was a monster. Kalen listened, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that soldiers' tales grew with the telling. One cycle, during the deep quiet of the station's simulated night, the lights flickered. The constant hum of the station faltered for a half-second, and the heavy thud of the stasis generator missed a beat. Red emergency lighting bathed the corridor in a blood-hued glow. An alarm, shrill and insistent, began to shriek through the halls. Kalen's training took over instantly. He snapped his rifle up, its targeting laser cutting a sharp red line across the room. Then, another flicker. The stasis generator coughed, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, the obsidian cylinder became transparent. There was no monster inside. There was a figure, vaguely humanoid in shape, suspended in a shimmering blue field. It was female, slender and graceful, with skin that seemed to shift like captured twilight. Her long limbs were curled inward, her head bowed. She was not raging or thrashing. She looked exhausted. And in that fleeting instant, as the emergency lights cast stark shadows across her form, Kalen saw the pain in the clench of her jaw, the tension in her limbs. It was not the posture of a monster. It was the posture of a creature in a trap, enduring an agony he could not comprehend. The main power kicked back in. The cylinder went black again. The alarms cut off, replaced by the calm, synthesized voice of the station AI, announcing a minor power fluctuation. System reboot initiated. All normal. But it was not all normal. Something in Kalen, a piece of him he thought had died on a jungle world years ago, had shifted. He stared at the black wall that hid her. The image of her suffering burned into his mind. He saw the faint tremor in the conduits feeding the stasis field, a sign of the system struggling to restabilize after the surge. He saw the life support monitor for the containment field, its primary feed blinking red before switching to a secondary backup. The system was strained. He glanced down the empty corridor. No one was coming. His own suit was connected to a small personal power conduit for life support and nutrient dispensing. It was a minuscule amount of energy, barely enough to keep a man alive. On a reckless, inexplicable impulse, he stepped over to a maintenance panel near the main stasis feed. His hands moved with practiced speed, prying open the cover. Protocol was clear: never interfere with containment. To do so was a capital offense. He found the tertiary life support feed for the prisoner, a line meant only for catastrophic failures. It was inert. Beside it ran the conduit for his own suit's dispenser. A simple bypass. A tiny, insignificant diversion of energy. It would do nothing, really. A drop of water in an ocean of power. But it was not about fixing the machine. It was about the gesture. He rerouted the flow. A flicker of green on the tertiary monitor confirmed the connection. He had given her a sip of water from his own canteen. A foolish, sentimental act. He sealed the panel and stepped back to his post just as the hum of the station settled back into its familiar rhythm. He had broken a dozen regulations. He could be spaced for this. Yet, he felt nothing but a strange, quiet calm. He had acted against protocol, against reason, for no other purpose than a flicker of compassion for a creature in a cage. The calm lasted for precisely 10 seconds. A low groan emanated from the containment cylinder, a sound of stressed metal, and something deeper, something organic. Then, a high-pitched whine began to build, escalating in frequency until it felt like a needle drilling into his skull. The blue light in the armored conduits on the floor flared violently, turning a brilliant, angry white. Cracks, like lightning, spiderwebbed across the obsidian surface of the cylinder. Containment failure imminent, the station AI announced, its voice devoid of any real alarm. Sublevel 9 is in lockdown. Kalen barely had time to brace himself before the cylinder shattered. It did not explode. It simply dissolved into a million shards of black dust, and a wave of force, cold and silent, erupted outwards. It was not a physical blast. It was a wave of pure psychic pressure that slammed into him, throwing him back against the far wall. His helmet cracked, and the world swam in a sea of static and pain. The last thing he heard before his comms unit overloaded with screeching feedback was the furious, amplified voice of Warden Forlag. Subject 0 has breached containment. All units to sublevel 9. Use lethal force. I want that thing atomized. The lockdown was absolute. Heavy blast doors slammed shut, sealing off sublevel 9 from the rest of the station. Red klaxons wailed, painting the corridor in strobing crimson light. Kalen pushed himself up, his head ringing. His rifle lay several meters away, its frame bent and useless. Through the haze of pain and disorientation, he saw her. The being from the tank stood in the center of the room, amidst the glittering dust of her former prison. The twilight quality of her skin seemed to drink the harsh red light, and her form, though slender, radiated an almost unbearable intensity. Her eyes, pools of liquid silver, fixed on him. There was no malice in them, no monstrous rage. There was only a deep, ancient intelligence, and something else, recognition. Kalen knew he was dead. Forlag's order had been explicit. He was a witness, a loose end. Worse, he was the one who had been on watch. They would find the tampered panel, and his act of foolish kindness would be twisted into sabotage. He would be executed long before he had a chance to explain. His life, measured in the cold calculus of the hegemony, was now worth less than the cost of the paperwork to report his death. He slowly got to his feet, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender he did not feel. The silver-eyed being, Lyra, as a nascent part of his mind suddenly named her, tilted her head. She took a step toward him, her movements unervingly fluid, silent. He braced for the end. Instead of an attack, she extended a long, graceful hand. He flinched, but she did not touch him. Instead, a tendril of faint, blue energy, like a whisper of light, coiled from her fingertips and brushed against the cracked faceplate of his helmet. The ringing in his head subsided. The static in his vision cleared. The oppressive psychic pressure that filled the room receded from his mind, contained by her deliberate control. She was shielding him. A heavy, metallic clang echoed from down the corridor. A cutting torch was being applied to the nearest blast door. Subwarden Jax's voice, raw with violent enthusiasm, barked orders on the other side. Cut through it. I want the kill shot myself. Kalen looked from the glowing slag on the door back to Lyra. An unspoken understanding passed between them. He was her only way out of this metal tomb, and she was his only chance of surviving the next 5 minutes. It was not an alliance born of trust, but of shared desperation. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He pointed down the opposite corridor, toward a service conduit he knew led to the asteroid's maintenance network. She understood instantly. As he turned to run, she raised her hand toward the door where Jax's team was working. A wave of force, a more focused and potent version of the one that had shattered her prison, pulsed down the corridor. It was not an explosion of fire and shrapnel, but a silent, crushing blow. The blast door buckled outward with a deafening groan, and the sounds of screaming and arcing electricity from the other side told Kalen that the first wave of guards would not be a problem. She had saved him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, as they fled together down the dark service tunnels, the pact was sealed. He was no longer a guard, and she was no longer a prisoner. They were fugitives, bound together by a warden's death sentence in a single, inexplicable act of mercy. The journey through the guts of Ethelberg was a frantic, desperate flight. They moved through humming service shafts and across precarious gantries, the sounds of pursuit always one step behind them. Kalen's knowledge of the station's layout, gleaned from years of mindless patrols, became their most valuable asset. He guided them through forgotten maintenance passages and depressurized conduits, places not even the station's schematics showed accurately anymore. Lyra moved with an eerie grace, her bare feet making no sound on the grated metal floors. She was a creature of silence and shadow, yet the power she held coiled around her was a palpable thing. Kalen could feel it as a static charge in the air, a low hum at the edge of his hearing. She was a storm held in check, and he was walking in its eye. Their destination was a small, decommissioned docking bay on the asteroid's dark side, a relic from the station's construction phase. It was their only hope of finding a ship. To get there, they had to cross a section of the asteroid's surface, a treacherous expanse of razor-sharp rock and vacuum. They reached an airlock that led to a maintenance platform. Kalen worked the manual controls, his breath fogging the inside of his cracked helmet. The outer door hissed open, revealing the stunning, silent majesty of the void. A blanket of stars, cold and diamond-sharp, was spread across a canvas of absolute black. A distant nebula painted a ghostly smear of purple and green against the darkness. He stepped out onto the surface, his magnetic boots clanking against the platform. The cold was immediate and absolute. Lyra followed, and for a moment, she paused, her silver eyes gazing into the starfield. Kalen felt a wave of profound, aching sorrow wash over him, an emotion that was not his own. He realized with a jolt that this was the first time she had seen the stars since her capture. She was looking at her stolen home. The trek across the surface was an ordeal. The asteroid's low gravity made every step a careful, floating motion, yet the risk of a misplaced bound sending one of them cartwheeling into the void was constant. They communicated with gestures, Kalen pointing out safe paths, Lyra occasionally touching his shoulder and projecting a feeling of warning, a sense of unstable rock or a pocket of high radiation ahead. They relied on each other utterly. They found shelter from a passing radiation squall in a shallow cave, a jagged scar in the asteroid's rock face. Inside, the silence was total. Kalen leaned against the cold stone, his suit's limited oxygen supply hissing softly. He looked at Lyra, who sat across from him, her form barely visible in the dim light reflected from the distant nebula. She met his gaze, and then she reached out to him again, not with her hand, but with her mind. It was not a voice. It was a flood. Images, feelings, raw data poured into his consciousness. He saw a dimension of light and energy, a place of flowing, sentient nebulae, and singing stars. He saw her people, the Ethel, beings of pure energy dancing in cosmic currents. It was a vision of a universe so beautiful and so alien it made his soul ache. Then the vision soured. He saw the hegemony ships, brutalist wedges of gray metal, tearing a hole in their reality. He saw the energy drills, the containment fields, the brutal process of capture. They hadn't wanted a weapon. They had wanted a key. Lyra was a unique confluence of energy, a living resonance that could be used to hold open a permanent gateway to her dimension. Warden Forlag wasn't building a prison. He was building a power plant. The hegemony intended to siphon the very lifeblood of her universe, an act of cosmic vampirism that would grant them limitless energy but would unravel her home, extinguishing her entire species. The images were sharp, painful. He felt her terror, her rage, her despair. He felt the long, lonely years in the cold dark of the stasis field, her consciousness a flickering candle in an endless storm. The sheer weight of her suffering was crushing, and he involuntarily recoiled from the psychic link. As he pulled back, his own mind offered up a memory in defense, a ghost from his past. He was younger, still a Marine, wading through the sweltering, fetid jungles of Cygnus X-1. He remembered the other soldiers, their faces slick with sweat and bravado, gathered around a campfire. They were boasting, holding up trophies from the planet's native fauna, a claw from a six-limbed stalker, the tooth of a great armored beast. They boasted of surviving Earth's transplanted predators, the genetically engineered grizzlies and wolves seeded on 100 worlds as a test of colonial fortitude. They had met them, and they had conquered them. He remembered their arrogance, their certainty that they were the apex predators of any world they chose to walk upon. Then, a thought slid into his mind, clear as a spoken word, but it was not his own. It was Lyra's. She had seen his memory, and her response was a feeling of ancient, pitying amusement, a thought that resonated with the wisdom of dying stars. You only met the friendly ones. The psychic contact broke. Kalen stared at her, breathing heavily. The casual, terrifying power in that simple thought chilled him more than the vacuum outside. She was not a monster. She was something far, far older, and the hegemony had not trapped a wild animal. They had chained a god, and they had no idea what they had done. He saw the scars on her psyche, the deep wounds left by her capture. And in that moment of shared vulnerability, she saw his. She saw the end of that mission on Cygnus, the collateral damage from an orbital strike he had called in, following orders. The village of native sentients, designated non-sapient by hegemony surveyors, incinerated because they were in the wrong place. The memory was a scar on his soul he had carried for years, the source of the emptiness that had hollowed him out. She did not judge him. He felt only a shared understanding of pain, of being a tool for a cruel, uncaring system. In the silent darkness of the cave, surrounded by the cold infinity of space, the jaded guard and the captive god found a common ground forged in trauma. He was no longer just helping her escape. He was fighting for her. He finally had a reason. The pursuit found them as they neared the decommissioned dock. A squadron of hegemony enforcers in armored exoframes descended from the sky on jump jets, their landing thrusters kicking up clouds of gray dust. Leading them was Subwarden Jax, his face a feral grin behind his polarized visor, visible on Kalen's damaged HUD comms. Nowhere left to run. Kalen, Jax's voice crackled. The warden wants the alien alive. He said I could do whatever I wanted with you. Kalen shoved Lyra toward the dock's outer hatch. Get inside. Get the ship powered. He found cover behind a rocky outcropping, pulling the heavy-caliber pistol from his hip holster. It was a pitiful weapon against armored exoframes, but it was all he had. He laid down suppressing fire, the shots ricocheting harmlessly off the guard's armor. It was a futile gesture, meant only to buy seconds. The enforcers advanced, their cannon-sized rifles spitting plasma. The rock in front of Kalen exploded into molten slag. He was pinned down, his death a certainty. Then, the air grew cold. The light from the enforcer's plasma fire seemed to bend and warp around the entrance to the dock. Lyra emerged from the hatchway, but she was changed. The faint twilight glow of her skin had intensified into a burning, silver-white incandescence. The very space around her seemed to ripple with contained power. She raised her hands. The metal hulls of the exo-frames groaned, denting inward as if squeezed by an invisible giant. One of the enforcers tried to raise his weapon, but it was torn from his grasp, twisted into a pretzel of useless metal. Jax, seeing the tide turn, fired his main cannon directly at her. A shimmering wall of force materialized in front of Lyra, absorbing the bolt of plasma with a hiss. She clenched her fists, and the enforcers were lifted from the ground, their armored suits creaking and buckling under the impossible pressure. With a final, dismissive gesture, she hurled them back, sending them tumbling end over end across the asteroid's surface until they were nothing but distant, silent specks. Jax, his suit's jump jets firing erratically, managed to halt his trajectory. He stared at her, his bravado replaced by pure, naked terror. "What are you?" he whispered over the open channel. Lyra did not answer. She simply looked at him, and the subwarden's exo-frame went rigid. Its power systems died instantly, and he began to drift helplessly out into the black, a silent monument to his own hubris. Kalen stared, awestruck. The raw, untamable power she wielded was terrifying, and she had used it to protect him. He hurried into the docking bay, sealing the outer door behind them. Inside sat a small, ugly courier ship, a Stinger class, caked in decades of dust. "Can you fly this thing?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She placed a hand on the ship's cold fuselage. The cockpit lights flickered to life. The engines whined, then settled into a low, steady thrum. The ship was awake. It was a part of her now, an extension of her will. They launched from the dark side of the asteroid, the ship's engines running unervingly silent. As they cleared the rock shadow, the full picture of their predicament became clear. Ethelberg was blockaded. A fleet of hegemony warships hung in the void like sharks waiting for a meal. At its center was the Warden's flagship, the Iron Hand. They were a minnow in a sea of predators. But the fleet was not the true threat. Lyra projected another vision into his mind, this one more urgent, more terrifying than before. He saw the Iron Hand, but he saw through its hull to a vast chamber within. In the center of the chamber was a colossal machine, a scaled-up version of her containment unit, built around a core of stolen, tortured technology. And at its heart, a rift was tearing open. It was a violent, unstable wound in the fabric of space-time, bleeding chaotic energy. The hegemony had not waited. They had already begun their plunder. The rift was failing. It was collapsing and expanding erratically, and Kalen understood with a sudden, sickening clarity that it would not just close. It would detonate. The uncontrolled collapse of a dimensional gateway would create a paradox, a feedback loop of exotic energies that would annihilate everything in this system, and then cascade, consuming her dimension as well. Two universes utterly erased. A direct fight was impossible. The hegemony fleet would tear their small ship apart in seconds. There was no escape. The end was not just coming. It was already here. Kalen looked at the roiling chaos of the rift on the ship's view screen, the death of two realities made manifest. Then, she showed him the only way. The vision was not of battle or victory. It was of sacrifice. The rift was unstable because it lacked a stable, organic anchor, a consciousness to act as a regulator, a bridge between the two dimensions. Lyra herself, weakened by her long imprisonment, could initiate the process, but she could not sustain it. Her energy form was too volatile. To try it alone would be to burn out like a dying star, accelerating the catastrophe. But there was another way. A hybrid anchor. Her energy, her essence, channeled through and stabilized by a different kind of matrix. A cruder, more resilient system. A biological nervous system. A human mind. She showed him what it would entail. A person would have to stand at the focal point of the machine, take her full power into themselves, and become the living seal. Their body would be consumed, their consciousness unraveled and rewoven into the very fabric of the gateway. They would cease to be a person and become a place, a permanent, living bridge between worlds. It was not death. It was something other. A transformation absolute and irreversible. The ship was silent save for the low hum of its engines. Kalen stared at the view screen, at the fleet, at the roiling wound in space. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from a life of following orders, a life of violence and emptiness. He had survived so much for so little. He had spent years running from the ghost of a crime he had committed in the name of duty, a hollow man in a gray uniform. What was he surviving for now? To drift in a stolen ship for a few more days before being hunted down? To watch two universes burn? He remembered the arrogance of the soldiers in the jungle. He remembered the pity in Lyra's ancient thoughts. Humanity saw itself as the master of the galaxy, a conqueror of worlds. But they were children playing with forces they could not begin to comprehend, and their games were about to burn down the house. His life was a currency of little value. But spent here, now, it could buy something extraordinary. Peace, a future, atonement. He had spent his entire existence taking orders from men like Forlag. Now, he could make one final choice that was entirely his own. This was not an order he was following. It was a debt he was paying. Kalen turned away from the view screen and looked at Lyra. Her silver eyes watched him, knowing his thoughts. She had shown him the path, but she had not asked him to walk it. The choice had to be his. In her gaze, he saw no expectation, only a deep, profound sorrow for the price that had to be paid. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. He did not need to speak the words. He walked to the ship's small navigation console and laid a hand on its cool surface. Then he moved that same hand and placed it flat against his own chest, over his heart. My life. For this. The gesture was plain, unmistakable. A single, silver tear, shimmering like a drop of liquid starlight, traced a path down her twilight cheek. She inclined her head, accepting his decision with a grace and solemnity that transcended words. In her mind, he felt a wave of gratitude so immense it was humbling. They were no longer fugitive and ally. They were partners in the salvation of worlds. Kalen took the pilot's seat. His hands were steady on the controls. Get us there, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The small ship banked, turning away from the false promise of escape and heading directly for the heart of the hegemony fleet. It accelerated, a tiny, defiant spark flying toward the devouring flame. On the tactical display, dozens of red icons, the hegemony warships, turned to intercept. Warning messages flooded the comms, demanding their surrender. Kalen ignored them all. Their target was the Iron Hand. It was a massive, brutal vessel, a kilometer-long wedge of armor and weapons batteries. They flew straight at it. Lyra stood behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He could feel a calm, cool power flowing from her, wrapping around the ship. Turbolaser fire, brilliant green bolts of energy, began to lance out from the hegemony cruisers. But the shots went wide, curving around the Stinger's hull as if space itself were bending to protect them. Lyra was shielding them, her power a subtle, irresistible force warping probability in physics. The hegemony command crew could only watch in baffled fury as the tiny ship flew through a storm of fire without a single scratch. They breached the flagship's shields and slammed into its side, the impact rattling the small ship's frame. They had not bothered with a docking tube. Lyra had simply peeled open a section of the Iron Hand's hull like a tin can. They were inside. Alarms blared. Hegemony soldiers in heavy combat armor swarmed the corridors, laying down a curtain of pulse rifle fire. Kalen and Lyra moved through it as if in a dream. He fired his pistol, his shots precise, disabling, forcing the soldiers back. But the true defense was her. She moved beside him, a whirlwind of silent force. Weapons were torn from hands, corridors buckled and sealed, and armored soldiers were tossed aside like dolls. They were an unstoppable force, a man with a final, absolute purpose, and a god unleashed. They reached the rift chamber. It was a vast, cathedral-like space, filled with the deafening roar of the unstable gateway. The air crackled with energy. In the center of the room, the rift machine pulsed, a cage of black metal struggling to contain the violent, swirling vortex of color and light that was the wound between worlds. On a command balcony overlooking the chaos stood Warden Forlag, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "Kill them," he roared, but his remaining guards hesitated, their fear of Lyra overriding their duty. Kalen did not even look at him. His eyes were fixed on the focal point of the machine, a small, circular platform directly beneath the raging heart of the rift. He knew what he had to do. He ran for it, his mag boots anchoring him to the deck against the gravitic turbulence. He reached the platform. He turned and looked at Lyra one last time. She was holding the guards at bay, a shimmering shield of force protecting his approach. Their eyes met across the chaotic chamber. He gave her a final, small smile. "It's all right." He turned his back to her and faced the rift. He took a deep breath. "Now," he said. Lyra dropped the shield. She raised her hands, and her entire being erupted in a column of pure, silver-white light that shot across the room and engulfed him. The pain was absolute. It was the fire of a billion suns, and the cold between galaxies poured directly into his nervous system. Every cell in his body screamed as it was simultaneously destroyed and remade. His bones dissolved, his flesh evaporated, his human senses shattered, replaced by a new, terrifying awareness. He could see the quantum foam. He could feel the weak nuclear force. He could hear the gravitational waves of distant, colliding black holes. His consciousness, his identity, the man named Kalen, was stretched to the breaking point. It was a thread, a single, fraying line in an infinite storm. He held on to one thought, the final anchor of his humanity, the memory of her pain in the containment cell. He had done this to stop that pain. He held that thought, that purpose, and he became it. The violent, raging vortex of the rift calmed. The chaotic colors softened, coalescing. The deafening roar subsided into a gentle, melodic hum. The storm was over. Where a wound in reality had been, there now hung a stable, shimmering curtain of light, an aurora of impossible beauty, silent and serene. The rift machine powered down, its stolen purpose gone. The lights in the chamber flickered and died, plunging the room into a semi-darkness illuminated only by the soft glow of the new gateway. The fighting stopped. A profound silence fell over the entire hegemony fleet. On the command bridge of the Iron Hand, Warden Forlag stared at the inert machine and the beautiful, placid light, his face slack with utter, soul-crushing defeat. His weapon was gone. His power was broken. It was over. 10 years passed. The collapse of the hegemony was swift. Without its promised source of infinite energy, its power structure, built on a foundation of lies and stolen power, crumbled. Systems long oppressed threw off their yokes. Warlords and governors who had pledged fealty found their authority vanished overnight. Out of the chaos, a new galactic concordiate was slowly, painstakingly formed, founded not on conquest, but on cooperation. The stable gateway in the Ethelberg system remained. It was no longer a military secret, but a symbol of the new era. It became known, in the quiet reverence of a dozen languages, as Kalen's Gate. Through that gate came the Ethel, not as invaders, but as ambassadors. They were a wise and ancient species, and they shared their knowledge of the universe freely, helping the younger races of this dimension heal the scars left by the hegemony. Trade, knowledge, and culture flowed through the gate, a bridge between two realities. A new station had been built in orbit of the gate, a place of diplomacy and science. On its foremost observation deck, two figures stood before a massive viewport, looking out at the soft, shimmering aurora. One was Lyra, ambassador of the Ethel, her twilight form now draped in elegant, flowing robes. The other was an older man with graying hair and a weary but kind face. Eris, the former chief engineer of Ethelberg, now a respected counselor in the Concordiate. He was one of the few who knew the full truth of what had happened. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the gentle, shifting colors of the gate. It was a place of profound peace. The hum of the old prison was gone, replaced by a silence that was not empty, but full. It was the silence of a promise kept. He would have liked this, Eris said finally, his voice quiet. The quiet. Lyra did not turn. Her silver eyes remained fixed on the light. She projected her thoughts into his mind, a feeling of serene, melancholic agreement. He is not gone. He is the quiet. Eris nodded slowly. He looked at the gateway, at the silent, eternal vigil it represented. The man had been lost, but the purpose had been found. Kalen was no longer a name, no longer a memory of a face. He was the bridge. He was the guardian. He was the peace that had cost him everything, and in doing so, had given everything to worlds he would never know. His sacrifice was not a story told in history books or memorialized in statues of bronze. It was written in the silent, enduring light between the stars, a somber and beautiful legacy that would last for an eternity.